Tyrannosaurus rex is one of the most famous dinosaurs in the world. Dozens of specimens have been assigned to Tyrannosaurus over the years. It's been the subject of perhaps hundreds of papers. But there's this very basic question about Tyrannosaurus that we can't seem to agree on. Do all these fossils assigned to Tyrannosaurus represent a single species, Tyrannosaurus rex, or perhaps multiple species? And remarkably, this very simple fundamental question about Tyrannosaurus has no definitive answer right now. We have historically tended to assume that there's just this one species, T-Rex, but several recent papers have challenged this assumption, and it's been suggested that the fossils from the Hell Creek of Western North America could represent 2 or even 3 different species of Tyrannosaurus. How many species were there? The short answer, well, how many species do you want? I'm going to argue here that the idea of more than one Tyrannosaurus is probable but not proven. So first of all, the Hell Creek Formation spans around 1 million years. There is more than enough time for one species to evolve and go extinct and be replaced by another species, either through immigration or via evolution. So given that, we might expect that there's more than one species there. It doesn't prove it, but it's highly suggestive. The other thing is that Tyrannosaurus is actually a pretty variable genus. Now, yes, this could be sexual dimorphism, it could be individual variation, it could be development, ontogeny, etc., etc. But there are differences in the maxilla, differences in the dentary, in the postorbital, in the squamosal, in the teeth, which are consistent, at least consistent with multiple species. Doesn't prove it, but suggests it. And some of these differences are indeed subtle, but subtle variations are precisely the types of variation that distinguish species. So the real question is not whether this variation is subtle, but whether it shows patterns, whether it's consistent, whether they're distinct morphotypes. Are certain characters consistently associated with other characters, as we would expect if they were in fact separate species? There is some evidence for stratigraphic separation, which might be consistent with the idea of a species evolving through time, but a lot more work would need to be done there. So species are always evolving. New species appear, old species disappear. Sometimes a single species will diversify over time and become multiple species. So if we look at big cats, for example, Panthera, in about 6 million years, we have a whole suite of species. We have lions, we have tigers, we have leopards and snow leopards and jaguars. And this diversity would have been, this big cat diversity would have been even higher as recently as about 10,000 years ago, except for the extinction of the cave lion and the American lion. So a fairly high number of species in just a few million years for these big predators. We also see very rapid evolution in birds. Modern dinosaurs, much smaller than most of the dinosaurs we study, but nevertheless, these are dinosaurs and perhaps a good model for understanding extinct dinosaurs. And what we'll see is that in the Galapagos Islands, for example, 18 species evolved in just 2.5 million years. We see even higher diversity in the Hawaiian Islands. The Hawaiian honeycreeper finches produce something like 50 or 60 species in just 6 million years. So the possibility that you could get lots and lots of species is entirely consistent with what we see in modern animals, including, well, modern dinosaurs, birds being dinosaurs. It has been suggested that rapid evolution is a characteristic of warm-blooded animals. It's plausible, but if you actually look at cold-blooded things like snakes and lizards, they also show this pattern. So it's a widespread pattern, not just modern birds and mammals. We see it in snakes, we see it in lizards. This is a molecular clock for sea snakes. And the Hydrophius, these sea snakes, this one genus, has produced something like 30 species in maybe 4 million years or less. So lots and lots of species being produced very, very rapidly. So this is just a kind of characteristic of modern animals. There are certain lineages, like, say, coelacanths, living fossils, that don't produce a lot of species, but I mean, kind of almost by definition, the lineages that don't speciate are kind of the exceptions because most of the species are part of these rapidly speciating groups. Otherwise, that's what produces most of the species, if you think about it. Now, we know it's all well and good to look at modern animals, and they're a great starting place. But obviously what we want to say, what we want to examine is, do extinct animals, and dinosaurs in particular, evolve like this? And it seems very, very likely that they do. So Ceratopsians are one of the best studied groups, and they show very, very high diversity and high rates of speciation and high rates of extinction. Now, some Ceratopsians, like Anchiceratops, seem to stick around for a couple million years, although it's also conceivable there's more than one species in there. But almost all these Ceratopsians are known for 500,000 years or less. They're very, very short-lived. Now, could Ceratopsians be special? I suspect they're probably not. The reason why we have these incredibly diverse phylogenies is because they have these great big frills and these robust skulls with lots of diagnostic features. They have horns and hornlets and frills and all these things. It's kind of like taxonomy on easy mode. They have all these features that they use to tell each other apart and to select their mates, and we can use these to recognize species. So we have a pretty good understanding of their actual diversity, and because these structures, these frills and skulls are quite robust, they have a good fossil record. And I think probably just all dinosaurs are doing this if we actually had a good fossil record. So yeah, dinosaurs also show rapid speciation and high diversity, lots of turnover. If we look at this not at the clade level, but at the formation level, we also see this. So for example, in Dinosaur Park Formation in Alberta, we have distinct species at the top of the formation and the bottom of the formation, and it spans something like 1.5 or 2 million years, give or take. Some of this turnover is evolution. So for example, Chasmosaurus belli directly evolves into Chasmosaurus cervinensis. Some of it is in fact replacement. So Centrosaurus is replaced by Styracosaurus, but doesn't give rise to it. The anatomy is inconsistent with it being ancestral. And then likewise, Styracosaurus is replaced by Pachyrhinosaurus. And this is presumably immigration, as one lineage is either going extinct and the other moves in, or perhaps one moves in and shoves the other one out, drives it extinct. It's unclear what happens exactly, but we're seeing turnover events here. And at the very top of the section, we have, for example, Pentaceratops shows up, and it seems to be replacing Chasmosaurus. So this turnover is ubiquitous. It is not just a feature of dinosaurs. It's not just a feature of Dinosaur Park. If you look at ammonites, they turn over so rapidly that we can use ammonite species as index fossils and say, okay, well, given that we have this ammonite species here, we're probably about, so many million years old because this one particular species has a very short stratigraphic range. Other times people will use pollen as index fossils. And again, these things show rapid turnover, sometimes every million years or every several 100,000 years. Conodonts show high levels of turnover. So turnover is the rule, not the exception. It would be kind of surprising if Tyrannosaurus showed no turnover whatsoever. So I would argue that the default hypothesis should be change, not stasis. We should expect Tyrannosaurus to show evolution. It's not to say 100%, definitely there's more than one species, but it's a reasonable starting assumption given everything we know about dinosaurs, ammonites, modern birds, mammals, etc., etc. Now, we also see this in the Hell Creek. The Hell Creek is not quite as well studied as Dinosaur Park Formation, doesn't have quite as many species, so it's not quite as easy to study turnover there. But the Hell Creek Formation spans, give or take, 1 million years, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. There should be ample time for a new species to emerge between the top and the bottom of the formation. Now, to put this in perspective, we humans split off from the Neanderthals maybe 600, 700,000 years ago. And within a few 100,000 species, Homo sapiens had emerged as a distinct species. Homo neanderthalensis had emerged as a distinct species. Some people call the Denisovans a distinct species. But the point being, in less than 500,000 years, we had what are widely considered to be distinct species of hominin evolving. So in 1 million years, there is no reason to think that you couldn't have more than one Tyrannosaurus species, 2, even 3 species. Now, so far, the only dinosaur that's been studied in detail through the Hell Creek, unfortunately, is Triceratops. It shows, however, at least 2 distinct species. So at the bottom of the formation, we have Triceratops horridus. It has a very short nose horn. It doesn't have that distinctive 3-horn face, the long nose horn that gives the genus its name, Triceratops. It has the short nose horn, and it has a small kind of S-shaped premaxilla. And as we move up in section, what we see is a more derived, more advanced Triceratops. It's got that long nose horn, 3-horned face, Triceratops, great big nose horn. The premaxilla is kind of U-shaped. It's very deep. It's very robust. And we're seeing a combination of things happening here. One thing we're seeing is evolution in response to sexual selection. So these horns are sexually selected. They're used either for display, combat, perhaps both, but they're related to the mating of these animals. And that's one force that's causing them to evolve over the course of this 1 million years. The other thing we're seeing is natural selection. The beak obviously is used for feeding. It's used for cropping plants, ferns or conifers or whatever the heck. And the beak is getting deeper and more robust. So as you move up section, it's generating higher bite forces. And this indicates it's probably eating tougher food. So we're seeing both natural selection and sexual selection causing an evolution morphology. And in particular, what we're seeing is suites of characters. Triceratops porsus isn't different in just 1 or 2 features, but several different features. The shape of the beak, The nose horn and the premaxilla maxilla articulation are all different as we move up section. So the default assumption. So first of all, I think it's unlikely, but not impossible, that there's more than one giant tyrannosaur, more than one Tyrannosaurus in the Hell Creek simultaneously. In general, as you move up the food chain, you tend to have fewer and fewer species. It's lonely at the top of the food chain. There's not as much food up there as there is towards the bottom of the food chain. There's a lot of competition. Big things tend to get in fights with each other. And so you don't, for example, see multiple species of great white shark. You don't see multiple species of orca. You just have the one. And in the same way, I think it's unlikely, but not impossible, that there's more than one Tyrannosaurus species in the Hell Creek simultaneously. Unlikely, not impossible. But we know that species in general tend to show fairly rapid evolution in geological terms. Dinosaurs and ammonites among extinct creatures, among modern creatures. We've seen, big cats, Galapagos finches, snakes and lizards. All these things show fairly rapid speciation. And given that we have about 1 million years here, lots of time for evolution, and given that the one dinosaur that we've studied in detail through this section, Triceratops, does show evolution, why would we expect T-Rex to be different? Why should it be special? I mean, it is kind of special. It's this one of maybe the largest land predator of all time, but in terms of its evolution, there's no reason to expect that it would be special. So we shouldn't. So it's entirely reasonable to suspect there's more than one species in there, which, to be fair, is far from proving it. So again, this idea that there's more than one Tyrannosaurus species is not some wild, crazy idea. We're not saying Bigfoot is real. We're not saying the Loch Ness Monster exists. The claim that over time, successive slight variations accumulate due to natural selection and sexual selection and transform one species into another is made by Darwin in 1859. It fits with everything we know about modern biology and paleontology. If anything, it'd be really, really surprising if Tyrannosaurus managed to stick around for 1 million years with no evolution. Could it be the exception? Sure. Probably not. It's probably not special. That being said, the idea that there's more than one species has been kind of controversial. So the first person to propose that there was more than one species, who's proposed a lot of controversial ideas over the years, is Bob Bakker. And he's cited in a paper by Larson in a personal communication, noting that there's this difference in the tooth structure. The T-Rex holotype has a very small first tooth, a small first incisor, and a big second one. Other specimens like AMNH 5027 don't show that. So Bakker was one of the first persons to say, hey, maybe there's more than one species in here. The first paper I know of that explicitly discusses this in the literature is by Larson in, I believe, 2008. And he lists a series of characters that differentiate T-Rex and this other species that he called TX. And unfortunately, some of these features show a bit of overlap between the two species. So for example, the tooth counts. The average is different, but there's a bit of overlap. Now, this is actually fairly characteristic of modern species. If you look at, say, gill raker count in certain salmon species, maybe in one it's 12 to 15, and the other it's 14 to 18. So there is some overlap, but if you look at enough of them, there's a difference in average. That being said, it's not super helpful for distinguishing them. If it's like, yeah, they're different on average, but there's exceptions. They're not as useful as diagnostic characters. And one of the characters Larson talks about, it kind of looks like they might be redundant characters. So he's talking both about the dentary incisor in the second tooth, and then the ratio of the second tooth to the third tooth, that these seem to be different ways of treating the same character. So it kind of looks like, hey, there's two characters, but they might actually be the same. So again, there's some interesting characters identified there, but even Larson thought it was interesting enough to point out, but not sufficient to name a new species. And then more recently, Greg Paul and colleagues followed up on this idea, kind of homed in on this idea that there's variation in the incisors, whether there's a single small first tooth or a small first and second tooth. And then in addition, noted some variation, extreme variation in the robusticity of the skeleton. And Paul et al. Identified not one, but two new species. So one of these, Tyrannosaurus imperator, is based on the famous Sioux specimen at the Field Museum and is characterized by two small first teeth. The other, Tyrannosaurus regina, is based on a Smithsonian T-Rex and is characterized by having a single small first tooth and a very gracile skeleton, it's argued, compared to your typical T-Rex. So basically we have just two characters: extreme variation in the robusticity of the skeleton and variation in the tooth number. And these are characters that could potentially diagnose different species, but it's a lot to hang on just two characters. We're going to establish two entirely new species. And skeletal robusticity is tricky. Like, yes, obviously species do vary in their skeletal robusticity. Dromaeosaurus has a really massive skeleton. Cernutholices, which is coeval, has a much more gracile skeleton. But it's also something that shows a fair amount of individual variation and specifically sexual dimorphism. So gorilla males, for example, have a much more robust skeleton than gorilla females do. So, and you might expect a lot more sexual dimorphism in big animals. It tends to be more pronounced in, say, sperm whales and elephants versus smaller animals like, say, rabbits. So I'm a little uncertain of hanging everything on just these two characters. And so a little bit of skepticism here. Could there be these three species? I think this is a really interesting starting point to discuss the existence of multiple species, this evidence, but it falls short personally what I'd want to establish a new species or two new species. Ideally, what I'd want to establish a new species is see multiple characters that differentiate the species. And furthermore, I'd want to see that these characters are associated. So Tyrannosaurus rex has character A, B, and C, and Tyrannosaurus imperator has characters X, Y, and Z, and they tend to track each other because that's typically what you see in distinct species. A little more recently, a rebuttal was published saying that there was insufficient evidence to identify two distinct species. I won't go into too much detail. I guess read the paper if you want to see the argument. I think there's some legitimate criticisms to be made. At the same time, it seems people are a little too quick to just dismiss this idea. Like, okay, maybe more evidence could have been marshaled, but at the same time, we shouldn't just dismiss this idea out of hand. Again, it's an entirely plausible, reasonable suggestion. So maybe what we need to do is dive in there and take another look at the evidence and see what it shows. My take, I think there's some really interesting points made, but I think to recognize two new species based on this limited number of characters feels like a bridge too far. And my hunch is there's likely to be more than one species, but I want to see good evidence for that. In Triceratops, you have multiple characters. You have the structure of the nasal horn, the structure of the premaxilla, and the nasal premaxilla articulation. And what's more, we can show that these characters are associated. You know, Triceratops prorsus always has the long nasal horn, the big premaxilla, and the vertical nasal premaxilla articulation. And so the fact that these things track each other tells us we have a separate population. And we also have stratigraphic separation between these things. We don't yet have that for T-Rex, which is not to say it doesn't exist. That's one of the funny things. For one of the most well-studied animals in paleontology, a lot of these specimens have not been really as extensively figured and described as you might expect. There's less work been done on the basic descriptive paleontology, maybe because, well, everyone kind of assumes, well, it's T-Rex. This was described a long time ago. Why do we need to describe it again? But there might be a lot more variation hanging there in the skeleton, hanging out, than we have really appreciated before. So what does it look like when we see separate species? Well, often the variations are quite subtle. If we look at species that diverged within the past couple million years, they're not that different. So they tend to have subtle differences. But these differences tend to be suites of characters that go together. So a case study that I'm quite familiar with because I fished these things for years up in Alaska are Pacific salmon. And they have certain suites of characters that you can use to diagnose them. And very quickly, very efficiently, you can rapidly pick these fish up and throw them into the bin for the appropriate species. So pink salmon, for example, have spotted backs and spotted tails and small scales. Red salmon tend to have turquoise blue backs, hexagonal scales, clear tails. Silvers have silver tails, as the name implies, and these great big fat tail stalks. They're kind of fat fish overall. Dog salmon are kind of skinnier. They have less silver on the tail. They have much thinner tail bases. Kings are great big, as the name implies, have black lips, fat tails, and lots of spots on the tail. So there's these subtle characters, but they always go together. And there's a number of different subtle characters that you can use. So often you want a couple characters in conjunction to diagnose your species. Although some species will have one character that's very distinct, like the hexagonal scales of the red salmon, for example, and that character alone can be enough to diagnose it. And so I'd argue in the same way that if we're looking at closely related dinosaur species that are not separated by tens of millions of years of evolution, but say one or two, what we're looking for aren't massive differences, but often subtle differences. But what we want to see is these differences are distinctive, are rather consistent. We're seeing consistent differences between these two populations, and there's multiple characters differentiating these populations, just not one or two. So I think what we need to do is the same way I would try to diagnose modern animals like, salmon or birds in a bird guide or whatever, is you want a suite of characters, at least 2 or 3, ideally 10 or 12 in a perfect world, which obviously we rarely live in paleontology. Our record is rarely perfect. But we want a suite of characters that consistently cluster together so these characters agree with one another. And do we in fact see anything like that if we take a closer look at T-Rex? So my intuition is that trying to make these things into 3 species, maybe people are kind of overplaying their hand a bit, but I think the case for more than one species is actually stronger than it appears at first, because there's a lot of these subtle differences within T-Rex that have largely been overlooked, and they hint at more than one species. And yeah, maybe some of them are individual variation, maybe some are ontogeny, maybe some are sexual dimorphism, but are they all? And what I'm going to say is if we go and we look at the maxilla, the postorbital, the scamosal, the dentary, and the teeth, there's a lot of variation there, maybe half a dozen different characters. And I think there's a really good chance we have more than one species. But I think teasing this apart, unfortunately, is going to take a bit more work. So first of all, the maxilla. The maxilla is incredibly short and deep in the T-Rex holotype, as well as in Scotty and Stanton specimens. It's about 85% as long as it is tall. It's about as long as it is tall in, say, 5027 or Sioux. So these things have this more elongate maxilla, and then in the T-Rex holotype, very, very short, deep maxilla. These are all very large, mature animals, so this is very unlikely to be ontogenetic. This is characterizes the adult morphology in each of these 2 different morphs. Insofar as a short rostrum increases the leverage of the jaws, this bulldog face generates a higher bite force, and the deep maxilla gives you a higher bending resistance. These animals are feeding different. The T-Rex morphology that we see in the holotype suggests a stronger bite force, even by the standards of Tyrannosaurus, which has this really powerful bite. Sioux might have had a weaker bite than the T-Rex holotype. And again, this variation is subtle, but yeah, say the variation between a lion and a tiger in their skull shape is subtle. This is consistent with there being more than one species here. The teeth also show these subtle differences. If you look at the holotype of T-Rex, at Scotty, at Stan, these are very straight and robust. The teeth have very narrow spike-like apices, the New York specimen, that is AMNH 5027, also Sioux and Tufts Love. So straighter, more robust teeth, more recurved teeth with slender apices. And again, this is of functional significance. These animals bit, killed, and processed their prey differently. This is the type of thing that separates species. The scamosal is also really different in these animals. So if you look at the holotype of T-Rex, you'll notice it has a really straight scamosal. And this is a derived feature. This is a weird feature. Other Tyrannosaurs don't have this. So you look at this and say, okay, the straight scamosal is a diagnostic feature of T-Rex. And we also see it in Scotty, and we also see it in Stan. But then you look at some other Tyrannosaurs, they don't show this. The scamosal is strongly bowed. It's downturned posteriorly in Sioux. It's downturned posteriorly in AMNH 5027, in Tufts Love. This is the primitive condition. This is what you see in something like Tarbosaurus or Bestachioversor. These animals are actually more primitive than the holotype of T-Rex in this one feature. So here we have this other feature that's suggestive that there could be more than one species in here. Then we have the dentary. And then holotype of T-Rex. This specimen has this incredibly deep jaw with a very prominent chin. And again, this is a very derived feature. It's shared with Scotty. There's the Dinosaurus imperiosus type, which I believe is currently in London. And they all have this really short, deep jaw. If you look at other specimens like Sioux, AMNH 5027 in New York, Tufts Love, also Stan, these have a somewhat shallower chin. They've got robust jaws, but not nearly as robust as the T-Rex holotype or Scotty. So again, we have this morphology. these deeper jaws, these shallower, more primitive jaws. We're seeing a variation between more advanced and more primitive specimens. And then the orbital ornament. And this is kind of a mess. This is all over the place. The variation does not fit into these nice, neat, discrete categories. So if you want to say, well, it could be sexual dimorphism, well, yeah, this is probably exactly where you'd expect to find sexual dimorphism. Orbital horns are kind of a display character, occasionally a combat character. So you expect these characters to show a lot of individual variation, sexual dimorphism. But it's also possible there are some species level differences because the sexually selected characters like horns and crests and frills are also what we use to distinguish species. And what you'll see is that in T-Rex, we don't have a postorbital in the holotype, but we do in the Scotty specimen, which is very similar in morphology to the holotype. It has this really prominent boss over the back of the head. These horns are bosses. And they vary a lot. Some of them are these massive rugosities or tall knobs, or these kind of semicircular, what they call Mickey Mouse ears that protrude up. But in other specimens like Sue, the Field Museum specimen, it's very low and blunt and doesn't project up that far. And so I kind of classify them, generally speaking, as low and not projecting very far, or projecting very far with a number of different morphologies. So we have a series of different characters here. We have got the maxilla, we've got the squamosal, we've got the postorbital, we've got the teeth, we've got the dentaries. How might we expect these characters to be distributed if we do in fact have several different species? And there's several different patterns these characters might show. So one pattern you might see is distinct clusters. So 3 characters in T-Rex, 3 characters in T. imperator, 3 characters in T. regina that consistently track each other. And this is what we'd expect to see if, for example, like with big cats, we had a radiation that produced several different species existing simultaneously. This is not impossible, but it's also not what I really expect because I strongly suspect we don't have 3 species living simultaneously in the Hell Creek. Again, that's just kind of my prejudice, if you want to call it that. I think that's unlikely, but this is one possible scenario where you see characters forming distinct clusters. A second possibility might be that we see sort of hierarchical clustering, that is clusters inside of clusters. So we have everybody shows certain characters, and you move up inside, there's a cluster with a suite of characters, and inside that there's another cluster of specimens with another suite of characters. And this is the type of pattern you might expect to see if, for example, we had replacement events. So we have primitive Tyrannosaurus, then a derived morphology moves in and replaces it, and then an even more derived morphology moves and replaces that. You would expect to see this hierarchical distribution of characters. That's another possible scenario we might expect to see if we had several distinct species, and basically maybe chronospecies replacing each other. And then the third scenario would be the scenario we might expect if we see a gradual evolution of Tyrannosaurus from more primitive morphology to a more advanced morphology. What we're going to see is not necessarily distinct clusters, but kind of like a grade or almost like a comb of branches coming off successively, and you have certain characters appearing at the base of the tree, other characters a little higher up, other characters a little higher up, and other characters even higher up above there. And this is what you might expect to see if we see evolution through time, which I guess chronospecies or anagenesis, whatever you want to call it. But a single lineage evolving through time, you'd expect to see this distribution of characters. This might also be taxonomically tricky because it might suggest it might be difficult to break Tyrannosaurus into these nice, neat, discrete species. So what do we see? Now, I've argued that these characters, the way I kind of came up with this distribution is I looked at the really advanced ones. T-Rex is thought to be very high up in the Hell Creek. Definitely Scotty is. It's up in the final 250,000 years of the Cretaceous period. It's the last and the most derived of the Tyrannosaurus morphologies. At the other end, lower in the Hell Creek and the more primitive, we have Sue and AMH 5027. So we've got these primitive and derived ones. And that's how I came up with these suite of characters. Primitive characters and advanced characters. Does everybody fit into that? And they don't exactly. So what we find is certain specimens show a mixture of primitive and advanced characters. So Stan, for example, it shows very derived morphology in terms of this very short, deep maxilla, this very straight squamosal, the single incisor tooth. The postorbital ornament is quite prominent. But it's primitive in having a relatively more slender dentary. So in all these features except one, it's almost as advanced as the T-Rex holotype and the Scotty specimen. Tufts love, on the other hand, is interesting because in most respects it's quite primitive. It looks like Sioux. It looks like the M&H specimen in New York. So it's got a very primitive maxilla. It has a very primitive bowed scamosal. It has pointy recurved teeth, relatively slender dentary, but it has a single small incisor anteriorly and a large second tooth. And the orbital ornament is very prominent. So a couple advanced features, but mostly primitive. Stand is the reverse, mostly advanced, and maybe one primitive character. So this is kind of really interesting. We have these characters that don't necessarily break these into discrete clusters, but rather we have a gradient between very advanced and very primitive, it appears. So what might that imply? My sense is that what we're seeing here is these animals form a series, a gradient, the morphological gradient from very, very advanced. The T-Rex holotype and Scotty is like the most advanced ones. On the other hand, we have these very primitive forms like Sioux and Ammonage 5027, and then everything kind of in the middle, things like Stan and Tufts love. Now, this could represent one hypervariable species, and some things have a lot of these certain characters, some have a lot of other characters, and there's everything in between. So could it be one hypervariable species? Maybe. Could it be ontogeny? Well, they're all really big. They're all T-Rex, so probably not. What it looks like a lot is potentially a species evolving through time. So if we try to arrange these species and cluster them or look at the distribution of characters or characters on a tree, what might we see? So this is a very, very, very quick and dirty attempt to summarize the data in a table. So, caveat emptor, buyer beware. The first caveat, this is based off of photographs in the literature. I didn't personally go out and look at all the T-Rexes to assemble this table. That's the way you should do it. I'm just saying I haven't had time to do that recently. But somebody definitely should. So it's not a lot of first-hand observation. This is just preliminary stuff I've done for this video. It's not peer-reviewed. It's a very limited sample. I haven't looked at every T-Rex because not everyone has great photos out there. So it's a limited sample. Take it with a grain of salt. Take it with a whole salt mine if you want. As much as anything, this is an attempt to organize my thoughts, to try and arrange this data in some sort of framework. But I do think that this approach, this general approach, even if the details might be wrong, is possibly going to be useful, maybe the most useful way we can approach the diversity in T-Rex and sort out its taxonomy. And here's the key thing. These characters are structured. They don't appear randomly. We don't get certain characters in random combinations, different specimens. They seem to appear in a particular order. The characters stack. We have certain characters that are present in almost all the Tyrannosaurus, then some that are found in fewer and fewer and fewer. And like we're seeing within this, we're seeing a gradual acquisition of characters from one specimen to another. And this is a tree that you can draw with this data. This is not a formal phylogenetic analysis. And again, we don't know whether these species actually stack in time the way that this tree might imply. But this is what you get when you try to organize these characters. At the very base of the tree, you have this entirely primitive morphology. And this is the American Museum specimen. This is Sioux. Then we see the appearance of a single incisor, and that characterizes like everybody else. Tufts love and the Smithsonian T-Rex. And then we see the appearance of Tyrannosaurs with prominent orbital bosses. And then we see the acquisition of the straight teeth, the straight scamosal, the deep maxilla. And then finally, we have the T-Rex holotype. We have Scotty that have this really deep symphysis. So what does this look like? This looks like a single lineage evolving through time. And obviously one of the testable predictions here is that these specimens are staggered in time, and there's some evidence in support of that. Again, Scotty is one of the last T-Rexes on Earth within that final 250,000 years. Sioux is fairly far down, but we don't really have a really tight stratigraphic constraint on where everybody else fits. So to summarize, there seems to be a lot of variation in Tyrannosaurus. Tyrannosaurus rex is a highly derived animal. The morphology that characterizes the holotype is up in the final 300,000 years of the Cretaceous. Others show a much more primitive morphology, and there appears to be at least some correlation with stratigraphy with primitive animals like Sioux lower down, but again, this really isn't well worked out. The anatomy seems consistent with a single lineage evolving over the course of a million years. This could represent, say, T. imperator giving rise to T. rex, or potentially T. imperator giving rise to T. regina, which gives rise to T. rex. The bottom line is I can't really tell you what's going on because I haven't personally studied these specimens in great deal. I haven't looked at everything. And as far as I can tell, no one else has either. I think someone really needs to go and look at these photographs in detail, photograph them, scan them. And it's really remarkable that a lot of these really beautiful skulls are not well described. So we're really struggling to actually know what type of features characterize T-Rex, what varies, and what might help diagnose these different species. There's a remarkable amount of just basic descriptive work that could still be done on these animals. And there's a need to just look at all these specimens, see what characters vary, score all this variation, throw it into a great big analysis, and see how the data arranges them, and then see if that actually makes any sense in terms of stratigraphy. So obviously the characters and data I'm presenting here should be considered very preliminary. This is almost a thought experiment that, hey, that's how science starts, is before you do the great big study, you have the idea for the study. But I think this problem is solvable, and I think this is probably the best way to do it. I don't put a lot of stock in morphometrics or principal components analyses. I don't think these things are actually very useful. Just simple presence-absence characters. Again, when you're out fishing, you don't say, oh, well, what species is this? Am I going to go over the limit on king salmon if I take this fish? Well, let me do a principal components analysis. Like, no, you look at the tail. So I think those analyses both overthink the problem and don't actually produce very useful results. And these simple presence-absence characters of the sort that fishermen use or bird watchers use are more than adequate to deal with these problems. We just need to get in there and actually categorize the variation. And I would really love to see this problem solved. Not because I think T-Rex is the most important animal in the world. It's a very well-known animal. How many more studies of it do we need? But I think that more careful case studies of these problems in dinosaurs are going to be really helpful going forward to understand dinosaur evolution. So again, we need more data. A lot of the time, when we get at these complex problems and debates, I'll say, well, we need more fossils. In this case, I think we do have enough fossils. If several dozen Tyrannosaurus aren't enough to solve the problem, probably nothing ever will be. I think what we really need to do here is study them a bit more closely. So finally, to try and answer the question posed at the very beginning, how many species are there? Well, if this scheme that I've thrown out there is right, which is a pretty big if, then it kind of depends. It seems to show a gradual transition from primitive to more derived morphologies, from primitive to advanced. How do you want to classify this? Is this just one species, Tyrannosaurus rex, evolving through time? Well, that is a legitimate way of looking at this. Generally speaking, not many things last for a million years, but hey, maybe Tyrannosaurus did. Another way, could we divide into two species? The primitive Tyrannosaurus imperator at the base of the tree, and the more advanced T. rex at the top of the tree. That seems reasonable to me. That seems entirely reasonable. Two species, fine, don't have a problem with that. But then what about the things in between that are kind of more advanced than imperator, but not quite T. rex? What do we call them? Well, okay, maybe we'll make those T. regina. So now we've got three species. Why three and not two? Well, I don't know. But then you say, okay, well, maybe we've got things that are a little more advanced than your typical T. regina. Is that a fourth species? And other things are a little bit more primitive, so make that a fifth species. Where do we stop? It's ultimately a bit arbitrary. Now, when you're looking at the end products of millions of years of evolution, you look at two lineages that have been diverged for 2 million years. At the end, they're quite different, and we're all happy to call them separate species. But they go back a million years. Well, they're still pretty different. But at 500,000, well, they're more similar. What about 250,000 years? Are they still separate species? Well, 100,000? At what point do they become sufficiently different that we call them separate species? And this is a hard problem. And ultimately what we're trying to do is we're looking at something that shows we're seeing a single continuous evolving population. This was not a series of discrete populations, but potentially a single population evolving through time. Where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the line to say this is a T-Rex, this is not a T-Rex, this is a third thing, a fourth thing, a fifth thing? And I can't really tell you that because at some level it's arbitrary. Charles Darwin himself called subspecies incipient species. So you have maybe you have a T. imperator 67 million years ago, and it gets a little more advanced. It's a subspecies, incipient species, and a little more advanced, a little more advanced, a little more advanced, and finally get a different species, Tyrannosaurus rex. That's one way of looking at the problem. This may not ultimately be a scientifically solvable problem, in the sense that if we do really have a single lineage evolving through time, we're going to have to arbitrarily decide where to draw the lines and how many lines to draw and how many species we have. So that's when I say, how many Tyrannosaurus species are there in the Hell Creek? Well, how many do you want? Thank you.